I'm Mark Golub, and in the news around the world are events that continue to unfold in the Ukraine. As conflict continues to grow more and more frightening with the virtual invasion by Russian troops of the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea, located on the northern coast of the Black Sea. The conflict began with a populist-led political revolution that threw the president of the Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, out of office and literally out of the country. Yanukovych took the position that the Ukraine should reject the idea of joining the European Union, arguing for Ukraine's retaining its economic ties to Russia. There seems to be an overwhelming sentiment in the western portion of the Ukraine in favor of the Ukraine's joining the EU, and more people turned against the Ukrainian president, whom people claim is under the thumb of Vladimir Putin. Putin, for his part, seems intent on maintaining economic control of the Ukraine and has sent Russian troops into the Crimea, arguing that he was only protecting the large Russian population which lives in the Ukraine. Ethnic Russians have lived in Crimea for centuries and look favorably on Russian forces and on Vladimir Putin. However, native Ukrainians living in Crimea and throughout the Ukraine feel very, very differently. Most Ukrainians want to live in a unified democratic country, one without corruption and one without dictatorship. For years now, the Crimea Peninsula has been recognized by international law as Ukrainian territory and as an autonomous republic. Russians, Ukrainians, and Tatars have lived together in the Ukraine for many years without any bloody conflicts. Actually, Tatars are the native population of the Crimean Peninsula and were exiled by Stalin to Uzbekistan. When Ukraine became independent, the Tatars were welcomed back to live on their historic homeland. And what the Ukrainians don't want now is for Russia to take over the peninsula again and then continue to take over the Ukraine. Ukrainians fear that Crimea will be a second Chechnya or worse, that Russians will expel the 40% of non-Russians in the Crimea back to, for example, Uzbekistan. The situation has grown more tense since it has seemed to bring President Obama and Vladimir Putin into direct conflict with each other. And as has happened so many times in history, the Jews who still live in the Ukraine seem to be caught in the middle. And for some insight, we are so pleased to be joined on our phones right now by Mark Levin, Executive Director of the NCSJ. Now, the NCSJ was formerly the National Conference on Soviet Jewry. It's been, since the 1990s, a leading U.S. organization advocating on behalf of Jews in what is now the former Soviet Union. It used to be Russia, the Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Eurasia. And Mark has often traveled to the Ukraine and other countries in the region. Actually, Mark Levin has served 3 times as a member of the U.S. delegation to meetings of the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe. And in 2008, Mark Levin received the Order of Merit Medal from then Ukraine President Viktor Yushchenko. And Mark, thank you so much for joining us on Shalom TV.
It's my pleasure, Mark.
Well, first of all, let me just get your overall reaction as you've seen events unfold over the last weekend and then this beginning of this week. What's your sense of the Russian incursion into the Ukraine?
Well, some of it is surreal because you listen to the justification for Russian actions by President Putin, and you wonder whether the facts that he's sharing with the rest of the world believes, because he still says that there are no Russian troops in Crimea, yet there are soldiers surrounding airports and government buildings, and when asked by Crimean citizens where they're from, they say Russia.
Right.
And today, just a few minutes ago, Secretary of State Kerry held a press conference after his meeting with the Russian foreign minister to discuss the diplomatic initiatives that the United States has undertaken. What is interesting is that while there is obviously a significant percentage of the population in Crimea that speaks Russian,
correct,
there's also a significant percentage of the population that doesn't want to see Crimea annexed by Russia.
Mm-hmm. You know, Mark, every now and then somebody points out on American television that the president who really fled the Ukraine and is now dealing with Putin, he was democratically elected by the Ukrainian people. Can you put into perspective how it happens that a democratically elected president of the Ukraine ends up having to flee the country?
But it's an interesting situation because the day before the president left, or days before, there was an agreement between the then opposition with President Yanukovych where there would be early elections, constitutional changes, and that these armed militia groups would turn in their weapons. Now, what's been fascinating about this whole the last 3 months in Ukraine is that the politicians, the leaders of the country, have been playing catch-up to the general population, most notably those who spent weeks, if not months, in Independence Square or the Maidan. And it was the people in the square and throughout much of Ukraine who told their leadership that this was an unacceptable deal.
Yes.
They wanted more. So it is true that Viktor Yanukovych won a democratically held election, but at the same time, an increasing number, if not an overwhelming majority of Ukrainians didn't like the direction that the country was headed in, didn't like the fact that there is rampant corruption, and it started at the top, and they spoke. They spoke in almost one united voice. Now, I'm not condoning or trying to rationalize the violence that took place, but it's important to remember that it was President Yanukovych who ordered the shots to be fired in the Maidan that killed dozens and dozens of Ukrainian citizens, and that led to the strong reaction from those people in the square and throughout Ukraine.
Yes. By the way, first of all, I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to tell you my sense, Mark, and you tell me again, do I have it right or wrong? Putting aside the historic relationship between the Ukrainian people and the Jews who lived in the Ukraine for many, many, many years prior to World War II and the Holocaust, putting that aside, in general, am I correct that the history of the Ukraine, especially modern history post-World War II, the Ukrainian people have not been a violent or revolutionary people? Do I have it correct?
Well, yes and no. I mean, because what we in America tend to forget is that there was always a strong Ukrainian nationalist sentiment that didn't accept the Soviet takeover of Ukraine. For many decades, there was an event called the Captive Nations Week, and the Ukrainians were in the forefront of this group. These were ethnic and nationality groups living in the United States and elsewhere who were demanding freedom for their brethren in the then Soviet Union. Again, not to go into all the details of the history of Ukraine, but there was always a strong sentiment for independence. And I think that became very clear when Ukraine led the way toward the end of the USSR in the late 80s, when they were the first government, the first group to demand to gain their freedom at the end of the Gorbachev regime.
Exactly.
And I think they set the stage for the Baltic countries and others to follow.
Well, in some way, they represent an idealism that broke with the former Soviet Union. And again, without trying to be simplistic, Mark, it would seem to me that most Americans and most Jews right now would be very sympathetic to the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian aspiration, and would be, at this point, critical of the Russian incursion into the Ukraine. Again, I'm asking you now, am I being oversimplistic here?
No, I don't think so. I think that even given the difficult history of Jews living in Ukraine, I think today most Americans and most American Jews support the aspirations of those who want a free and to continue to see a free and independent Ukraine.
Exactly.
That doesn't alleviate our concern about anti-Semitism, xenophobia, ultranationalism, but it's not state-sponsored, and we've had a history over the last 2 decades of working with successive Ukrainian governments and NGOs to try to address these issues, particularly those far right-wing groups who've tried to make the Jews the scapegoat for every economic and political problem that's existed over the last 20 years.
Okay, I want to pick this up, and of course that's the real reason I wanted you to be on, and I'm so grateful for the time. On one hand, often one hears a Jew here in America sort of say in bewilderment, what is a Jew still doing in Germany? What's a Jew still doing in the Ukraine? What's a Jew still doing in the former Soviet Union, especially when the history, I'm now speaking specifically of the Ukraine, there is a very troubling history of Jewish persecution and pogroms in the Ukraine by the Ukrainian people that goes back now more than 100 years. My first question for you is, Mark, what extent is there, to what extent is there a real Jewish population today living in the Ukraine?
There is a significant Jewish population in Ukraine today. It's hard to estimate, but the numbers range from a couple of 100,000 to possibly as many as 350,000. There may be anywhere from 15 to 17,000 Jews living in the Crimean region. It's a population that covers all generations.
Why are they there still?
Well, I think many people, when they were given the opportunity to emigrate, either to make aliyah to Israel or to join family members elsewhere or just to leave the country, decided that they had an opportunity to help build a new Ukraine.
Okay.
A more tolerant, more pluralistic country, and they saw their future in their homeland.
Okay, and by the way, while I may be bewildered, I'm not critical. It's interesting, and I think you say it very well. People make choices that seem the wisest and in their own best interest. And okay, so you're now telling us there's a significant Jewish population in the Ukraine. Before this entire flap with Russia moving into the Crimea and threatening the Ukraine in general, how have the Jews over the last 5, 6, 10 years been treated, those who live in the Ukraine?
Overall, well, there have been problems. There have, as I said before, there have been problems related to anti-Semitism. But the big difference is that NCSJ and others, both in Ukraine and in the United States, have been able to address these concerns with successive Ukrainian governments. Do they have a perfect record? No, but it's been a very open and frank and forthcoming discussion with the successive governments, and we've been given indications with this interim government that it will continue. As I said, it's not a perfect environment, and today there have been some serious incidents over the last few months. But the most important thing to remember, Mark, is that right now Jews are not being targeted by this interim government or far right-wing groups as scapegoats, as the reason that the country is in turmoil, as the reason for these very difficult economic times. And that's a big change. I would like to think that that between the growing Ukrainian Jewish community and their supporters outside of Ukraine is a primary reason for this.
Mm-hmm. You know, we have seen this virulent anti-Semitism once again reemerge in Europe, Western Europe even. And you say there have been incidents. Am I correct, Mark? There's been nothing in the Ukraine as serious and as endemic as we've seen in the resurgence of anti-Semitism in Europe.
That's correct.
And yet you did say there have been significant.
Well, there have been incidents.
For example, give me an example.
Well, I mean, just recently there was a synagogue that was spray painted with graffiti. There was a firebomb at another synagogue. But there are many in Ukraine who believe that these may have been instigated by those who wanted to paint this new interim government in a poor light. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're dealing with. I mean, what we have tried very hard at NCSJ to do is not to cry wolf, but to try to look at each incident and see if there has been, if there is a pattern of behavior, whether we can connect the dots. And so far we can't. Now, in this interim government, there is a far right-wing group that's part of the ruling coalition, and that's troubling to us. We've expressed that concern to the other members of the coalition. We expressed it before they became part of the interim government. We're watching what they do very closely. I don't think it's by accident that some of these far right-wing groups that became so visible and public during the demonstrations were able to do what they did if they didn't have the support of this group called Sloboda, and that for us is troubling. We don't want to cry wolf, but we also don't want to be in a position that Jewish communities were in Greece and Hungary.
Yes,
where everyone tried to dismiss the growing influence of these far-right groups, and when economic catastrophe hit, who were the first people to be blamed for this economic catastrophe? The Jews. And who gained the most popularity? These far-right groups. We don't want to see that happen in Ukraine, and that's why we've expressed our concern, and that's why we've been so active in trying to minimize the role and influence of this one group in particular, but of these far-right groups in general.
Yes, and by the way, I really hope our audience appreciates what you're saying. And the NCSJ has had this fabulous reputation, and one of the things that you are characterized by is this. You talk about crying wolf. You don't cry wolf, and therefore, when you do alert the world Jewish community, and especially American Jewry, to a problem, it's because there really is a problem, not because you're seeing, people under the bed when there are none. And therefore, I ask you, Mark, at the moment, how frightened are you for the Jews of Ukraine?
I am concerned about the overall situation, and if there isn't a resolution, where all this could lead. But right now, based upon all of the conversations and emails and letters and watching the news, in talking with Ukrainian Jewish leaders, Jews are not being singled out. They're not being targeted. They are fortunately not one of the main actors in this drama that's taking place right now. And what we're trying to do is to ensure that stays the case. Now, one thing we are working with the local, or I should say with the national Ukrainian Jewish leadership with, is to ensure that there is adequate security around Jewish institutions. So, so that whether it's a provocation or whether it's some other type of anti-Semitic act, that there won't be harm to individuals or to institutions. So, there is a great effort by a number of people in the Ukrainian Jewish community and outside to make sure that resources are available to address these legitimate security needs. But Mark, two quick examples.
Please.
There was an open letter by Ukrainian Jewish leaders that included a number of Jewish religious leaders urging Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine. Today, there was a letter sent out by just about every part of the Ukrainian Jewish community to President Putin, urging a resolution to the issue and trying to set the record straight about the situation of Jews in Ukraine. To me, these are two remarkable acts.
Yes.
And accurately describe what's happening in Ukraine today. And again, I don't want to diminish history. I don't want to diminish the work that we and others have done to try to get the Ukrainian government to focus on anti-Semitism. But today Jews remain overall in a safe environment.
That's wonderful. It's wonderful to hear. Incidentally, Mark, describe for me, just give me a profile of what you feel in general the Jewish community of the Ukraine is like. What's its demographic, and where are they on the economic scale?
They cover the entire spectrum of the economic scale, from the very poor to the very wealthy, from the young to the old. The largest community is in Kiev. There are large Jewish population centers in Odessa, Kharkiv, Dnepropetrovsk, throughout the country. It's a largely urban population, highly educated. There is wonderful work being done by the Jewish Agency, JDC, World Org, and different religious streams to try to bring a real sense of Jewish identity, as well as trying to meet some of the very serious social welfare needs that the state can't support. This is a fully engaged community.
Mm-hmm.
It does it mirror the United States? Not yet, not yet. But how many communities really do?
Exactly.
But I would rather remain optimistic about the future than not.
And what about the Jewish vibrancy of the Jewish community of the Ukraine? Is there a real Jewish sensitivity there?
There is, but Mark, the other thing, and I think this is something that most Americans just can't appreciate, where the Jewish population of Ukraine, let alone the Jews living throughout the former Soviet Union, were at the time that the Soviet Union imploded. We take so many things for granted in our country. Our ability to worship freely, our ability to create community, to build communal structures. Almost none of that existed in Ukraine and other parts of the former Soviet Union. I won't say we're starting at Aleph, but it was pretty close.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happened over the last 23 years since independence is really remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I always like to look at a glass as half full, and I always tell people we've scratched the surface. Have we reached a critical mass of people yet in Ukraine? Probably not, but there are rabbis, educators, young people who are trying to build the institutions that define what a real Jewish community looks like.
Yes.
And if they're given if they have the opportunity to continue their work, I think we will be looking at a next 10 years. Now,
Amazing. By the way, do they have a connection to Israel?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and again, we're not talking about. I'm not talking about huge numbers or a huge percentage of this Jewish population, but it's growing.
Mm-hmm.
There are birthright trips. There are Jaffe summer camps. Hillel is there. You have the Reform community there. You have an Orthodox community. There's even now the conservative movement has started a congregation in Kiev. So we have all of the elements, religious, cultural, educational, to maintain and strengthen this growing Jewish community. The question is whether the political environment will remain an open one to allow all of this to take place.
Mark,
and that's where we come in.
Yes, this is a fascinating description for us, and most American Jews just have no sense of this. It's wonderful that you've spent a moment giving us a profile of the Ukrainian Jewish community. I can't have you on without asking you to spend 30 seconds from your position. If you were in the White House counseling the President of the United States, would you want the United States to move in any specific direction at the moment?
Well, I think we have to exhaust every diplomatic possibility that we can. No one is calling for a military response to what's going on.
Of course.
But I think there are diplomatic initiatives that could include economic sanctions.
Yes.
That would get the attention of the Russian government.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think the fact that Secretary Kerry did go to Kiev and then went on to Paris to meet his Russian counterpart is so important. This is a defining moment for President Obama and his administration. This is a defining moment for our country. We need to rally the support of our European allies to ensure that a country's territorial integrity is respected.
Yes. Look, Mark, it's been, 20-some years that you have been doing extraordinary work with the NCSJ. And I only want you to come into the studio one day and just sit with me at the table and talk about, first of all, we'd love to know more about you personally, but also the work you've done has been in many ways heroic. And I thank you for the service you've in some way performed for not only American Jewry, but for world Jewry. You're doing a fabulous job. Kol tuv v'hatzlacha. May you only go from strength to strength, and we'll speak often.
Mark, thank you very much, and I look forward to visiting you in the studio.
I look forward to it too. You be well.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you very much. The words of Mark Levin, the ideas of Mark Levin, who's executive director of the NCSJ, formerly known as the National Conference on Soviet Jewry. I say formerly because although, in essence, that's what you can put up, on the screen, the NCSJ at the moment is undergoing an evolution of its own. It really represents all of the Jewish community in the former Soviet Union. But Mark Levin has been in the forefront of the Jewish connection from here in America to all the Jews of the former Soviet Union, and he does marvelous work. And it's just wonderful to get a perspective on how this affects the Jews of this former Soviet Union and the Jews who live in the Ukraine, and to hear what Mark feels the future of Ukrainian Jewry is as the entire world is focused on Russia's incursion into the Ukraine. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to the ideas expressed by Mark Levin. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I always love hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.